statue of Zeus, and they had a statue of Athena. They set them up in a kind of niche, apparently, and they worshipped them, by which seems to have been the case that they would have wreathed them with some kind of ornamental wreath and burned incense in front of them and maybe said a prayer. Irenaeus says the same thing about the Carpocratians, that they had Pythagoras and Jesus and Plato statues all set up in a niche, and they wreathed them and burned incense to them.
The example I always use is I call the Alexandra amulet. It's a 37 centimeter long piece of silver, and it says, "Protect Alexandra whom Zoe bore from every demon," and then just lists this long list of demons, and protect her from sorceries and curse tablets. And I'm like, okay, this is a super expensive piece of hardware. This is a huge piece of silver, so this is not like some secret cheap this is potentially a family heirloom. Like
the Nicene author or preacher, as he's called, says that everybody worships the snake, not just us, because the snake is a symbol of Christ, and the snake is found in every temple. You can go to any temple and find snake-like imagery, and that's just a reminiscence of Christ the snake.
Parishioners using amulets, and he's very degrading. He's like, these old women and children relying on amulets. Why rely on them instead of the king of everything, Christ? And he specifically is referring to these amulets that presumably were coins with the head of Alexander the Great on them. So why rely on this Greek king when you could rely on the king Christ? But ironically, like a few homilies later, he says, what's a really great thing is to hang some quotations of the Gospels from your bed.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Henry, Religion for Breakfast. If you know about my channel, you don't know about his channel. I don't know how that's even possible. If you like this type of content, Religion for Breakfast is where it's at. And on top of that, Dr. David Litwa is here as well, and that is another newer channel, but also bring in scholarly approach to this text, to this stuff. And he also has they both have Patreons. By the way, I'm a Patreon of both of you. So I'm telling you this is who I would support, and I recommend it. And I'm really, this is a first time thing having both of you on at the same time right now. And also my co-host for today is Sobek from the channel We Are Being Transformed, another new channel. Go and subscribe. I have links for all three of those in the description. Check all that stuff out. And let's get into it. And the topic is early Christian magic, and even later 4th to 7th century Christian magic. And so I want to start off with you, Dr. Litwa, because we hear about this character, Simon Magus. And I know you've done a lot of work in the early Christian denominations who are later called heretics by the church fathers. But in the beginning, they weren't called heretics. They were just other Christians. Now, my question is about Simon Magus, who is also known as Simon the Sorcerer or Simon the Samaritan. What kind of movement is coming out of that? Is coming out of him? He historically, what do we know about him, and what kind of movement of Christianity is he leading?
Well, thanks, Neil. Good to be on. So I'm distinctive. I call him Simon the Samaritan, so there's no real link with him with Samaritan religion. I know that other scholars have tried to link him with Samaritanism, and when you add that T, you're referring specifically to a religion of Central Palestine that was sort of the sister religion to Judaism, but instead of being focused on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, it was focused on a mountain called Mount Gerizim, which is in Central Palestine. Simon seems to be fairly independent and seems to arise out of more or less a Hellenic or Hellenistic milieu. And when you look at the cities of Samaria in the 4th century, there's really only one major city at the time, and that's Sebaste. And this city was very much of a Greek city. And in fact, Herod the Great built this city, or rebuilt it, and dedicated it to Augustus. and put a big temple of Augustus right in the center of the city, and it, had an amphitheater and a theater and a race course, etc., etc. All the trappings of a Greek city, and this seems to be the area in which Simon thrived as a
Wow.
private religious entrepreneur who at some point became a Christian. Even the author of Acts doesn't try to deny that, although later Christians will try to deny that.
Right.
He becomes a Christian, he becomes baptized, and he leads a movement as a sort of apostle in Samaria. And then this movement seems to spread in the course of the second century. I think it spreads both to Alexandria and to Rome. And yeah, it grows so large that Justin Martyr in the mid second century says that virtually all Sumerians are Simonians. And they worship a statue in Rome on Tiber Island. And so, he really historically locates them. Simon also had a companion named Helen, and they seem to have made some kind of apostolic team, and belief in Helen as the divine wisdom figure was just as important as belief in Simon.
Wow. And now you said that this statue was of Simon's the Samaritan that they were worshiping.
Well, it seems that this is highly disputed because the person reporting this, Justin Martyr, seems to mess up the inscription. But what seems to have happened, I think, is that there was a statue to a native Italic deity called Simo, and that Simonians identified this Simo with their Simon, as he was pronounced in antiquity, and apparently gathered there in convocation and made the claim that the Romans had actually set up the statue in honor of their founder
Sure.
because of the benefits that he had given to the Roman people. After his dispute with Peter, Simon went to Rome and performed magic, miracles of beneficence, so beneficial that the Emperor Claudius gave him a statue, which was a divine honor. So, in fact, the Simonians were claiming that Simon was part of the Roman state pantheon.
Now, before I go over to ask Dr. Henry a question, the last thing I want to ask is why does Simon Magus, why does he get so identified with magic? Is there something in text of Hippolytus or Irenaeus or Justin that says he's performing some sort of magic? What's the you sort of often get him tied, or is that just some misconception? Maybe.
Yes, Simon Magus only becomes Magus with Irenaeus, who is writing between 180 and 189. So he's really just Simon the Cimmerian. When you read the author of Acts, he's not called a Magus, but he is described with this Greek verb called maguon, that he's doing the work of a Magus, which is close enough, I guess. Um, and then Irenaeus says that his followers practice magical activities such as love spells and sending um, what he calls attendants to people who are these daimonic assistants, and then also dream senders. So sending daimones, which are these mediating beings, the middle management level of deity, to give people certain dreams which will influence them. Now, what's interesting is he says this about other groups too, and unfortunately, we just have no confirming evidence. But I mean, because these practices were so common, you wouldn't necessarily root, you wouldn't necessarily throw out this witness. But it is a little bit odd that Irenaeus says that both Simonians both exercise demones and they invoke demones. And to me, as a historian, I sort of want to ask, well, which one was it? Did they expel them or did they invite them? Possibly both, but probably unlikely.
Interesting. Now, I want to jump ahead now because by the time we get to the 4th century, now we have a whole network of bishops and doctrines, and there's churches all over the place. It's becoming a more refined, and there's a lot more dogma happening. So, Dr. Henry, we're going into your area now. What is the different? Like, how different is Christian magic in this time period compared to what we just heard from the example of Simon Magus, for example?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily overstate the power of the bishops, though. The ancient historian Kim Bowes has a great quote where she says that the bishop of the 4th and 5th century was a rather anemic creature that wasn't really aware of being part of a larger institution. Like they couldn't really do that much. And I think a great example is John Chrysostom, who's one of the most famous uh, bishops of early Christian history. He was the bishop of Antioch and later the bishop of Constantinople. So he was a big deal, but much of his homilies are him complaining about his flock not listening to him. So he has a few instances where he's complaining about his parishioners using amulets, and he's very degrading. He's like, these old women and children relying on amulets. Why rely on them instead of the king of everything, Christ? And he specifically is referring to these amulets that presumably were coins with the head of Alexander the Great on them. So why rely on this Greek king when you could rely on the King Christ? He complains about amulets on several occasions, but ironically, like a few homilies later, he says, what's a really great thing is to hang some quotations of the Gospels from your bed. That's something you could do to keep demons away. So like he himself, is inconsistent between what we would call magic. Hanging a scrap of the gospel from your bed sounds kind of talismanic. He, in one of his more anti-Semitic homilies, says, synagogues are places of demons. So, but while you walk past a synagogue, make sure you make the sign of the cross, which is a very sanctioned, ecclesiastically friendly gesture, but it's a protective ritual in that situation. How is that much different from other protective rituals? So another great example is the Council of Laodicea, which published this long list of decisions that were made at the council. This is a 4th century council. And one of the laws promulgated by the Council of Laodicea is this long diatribe against monks and bishops using amulets. It's like monks shall not be soothsayers or fortune tellers or makers of amulets. And the fact that they had to promulgate that law implies there were monks and bishops out there making magic, engaging in magic. And if you think about it, if you're living in some small town in 5th century Syria, you need somebody that's a literate specialist, someone who knows to read and write to make you an amulet. And who's the one person in town that can do that? It's your local bishop or monk. So a lot of the stuff that we see, both in Egypt and Syria and Anatolia, a lot of the archaeological evidence of so-called Christian magic appears to be the result of a Christian religious functionary. A great example I always use is I call the Alexandra amulet. It's a 37 centimeter long piece of silver that presumably comes from the regions of Beirut. We're not quite sure where it was found, but it dates to the 4th century. And it says, "Protect Alexandra, whom Zoe bore, from every demon," and then just lists this long list of demons, and protect her from sorceries and curse tablets. And then near the end, it's like this it lists like 25 archangel names, then ends with, in the name of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, protect Alexandra. And I'm like, okay, this is a super expensive piece of hardware. This is a huge piece of silver. So this is not like some secret cheap, this is potentially a family heirloom. Like whoever Zoe was the mother of this girl. I'm assuming it's some teenage girl, Alexandra. And like, we care so much about protecting our daughter. We're going to commission someone to make this huge amulet. And who knows the names of 25 archangels and liturgical phrases to include in this amulet? Probably a local bishop. There's nothing explicitly Christian in it. It's possible it was made by a Jewish rabbi as well, but I think it's probably a Christian bishop or monk or some sort of literate religious specialist. So in my mind, it's mixing and matching. You have I don't so much say like it's orthodox versus heretics, but it's syncretists versus anti-syncretists. So the people that are like, no, don't do the traditional stuff, do only what I say you should do. So anti-syncretism, which is this term meaning about like religious mixing or assimilation, or the syncretists that are like, oh, I'm totally fine with that. And that's like the monks and the bishops at the Council of Laodicea were condemning, who presumably were very happy to serve as fortune tellers, astrologers, amulet makers.
That's very fascinating. Go ahead, Sobek. You had a question?
No, I just had a little something to add there.
Yeah, sure.
What Dr. Henry was talking about here in terms of like, it kind of just made me think about this whole concept. Jonathan Z. Smith called it religious entrepreneurship, right? Um, would the people back then have seen these bishops any different from the other religious specialists around them? And it also reminded me of this conversation I was having with Dr. Edward Watts on his book, The Final Pagan Generation, where he said, you're so inundated with the divine, and all of this stuff is just, you know, even taken for granted. Tertullian, for instance, when he's like railing against like the taking part in the rituals of the household, he's very much like in the minority. A lot of the people are still saying, "Oh no, you could still do it at that time." So yeah, you have these syncretists and these
Yeah, and
anti-syncretists, and it's just very
you're
interesting.
hinting at forms of authority too. So the famous sociologist Max Weber, who's kind of like this big deal in religious studies, theorized about different types of authority. You have charismatic authority. So this would be like your freelance ritual expert who's super charismatic, convinces everyone that you have the lock on divine information. And then you have more traditional forms of authority, institutional authority. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I would say John Chrysostom had both institutional authority and charismatic authority. Jesus, presumably, only charismatic authority, doesn't seem to be tied to any particular institution like the temple in Jerusalem. When I envision these rituals, how they played out on the ground, we can envision maybe a local charismatic preacher who's like, "Hey, I can make you that anti-dysentery healing spell," or maybe it was an institutional authority figure. And we see both play out in, at least in late antique Egypt, where it seems a lot of the so-called magical stuff is being produced by institutions. I mean, the so-called Greek magical papyri are the literary productions of Egyptian temples and Egyptian priests, and they certainly didn't say what we're making is magic. Like they wouldn't use the term magia or mageia to refer to what they're doing. It's like, oh, I'm just compiling formula on how to heal a migraine headache, and then we later, 2,000 years later, call it magic.
That's a great point.
Fascinating.
Now, let me ask you this too. Now, when these rituals that we see in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, when they're being, put in place for mass, for example, would you consider that to be some sort of act of ritual magic in a sense?
I mean, I just want to use the word magic. I mean, I would say think in terms of the agency and the efficacy of the material object. So
Right.
we often think here in the 21st century that like matter is just this inert stuff. But imagine a religious world where materiality has a great deal of efficacy and agency. So a great example of this are Christian icons. I mean, Coptic Orthodox Church, the Byzantines speak about icons like literally reaching through the icon and touching you to heal you. There's this great story in the from like a Coptic Orthodox historian where like a bishop who was kind of sick goes to pray in front of a icon of the Virgin Mary, and he prays for days and days and days, and then he kind of swoons and falls against the icon, and then in a vision, Mary like reaches through the icon and touches him. So like the agency of the object is so alive there. So I mean, we can. I just think it's a little simplistic and maybe a category error to say, oh, that's magical. But
Gotcha.
to say that like the Greeks and the Romans and the early Christians like called thought objects had agency. Yeah, sure, they definitely
That,
did.
that's a good answer. But you now I have to ask you about this before I go over to Litwa for another one. The iconoclasm movement that happens in the seventh, maybe sixth century. What
I
is
think
the
eighth century.
what happened there? Because we're going from the image of Christ being something that people should be worshiping and looking at, to all of a sudden, no, that's bad now. Is what causes this movement to arise?
In terms of like sixth and seventh century, I mean, like the idea of venerating an object, and that's potentially heretical to a certain type of anti-syncretist. And so there's the people that do, the Christians that eventually do settle on, yeah, icon veneration is totally great. They're very careful to say, oh, we're paint on wood is what we're talking about. We're not talking about a graven image here. So they get very specific about the type of object they're referencing.
Like Dr. Litwa, I want to ask you about this because you do a lot of studying in different early Christian groups that are deemed heretical later on. And I'm wondering, since we're on the topic of magic, and uh, even if it's not classified as magic or thought of as magic, but like we're looking back and seeing rites that are people doing things with an object or an amulet. What are some of these early Christian groups that pop out at you that seem to be not exactly what you would hear from most Christian groups that sort of pop out at you?
One way of dealing with this is when it's often Protestants who are looking over their shoulder at the Roman Catholics or the Greek or Orthodox or whatever, and looking at their rites. And historically, since the time of the Reformation, Protestants have liked to play this apologetic game of that these other Christians are doing magic while as we're doing religion. So this is almost like an intra-Christian apologetic. Um, and the thing that I like to remind people is, I mean, Protestants also do activities which could also be classified or categorized under magic. I mean, I think of Bible magic and Bible divination. I mean, in my youth, I was familiar with people who would do what has been called lucky dipping, just trying to find an answer to God, and it's an answer from God to a prayer. And they would just open the Bible at a random place and then read the first thing that their eyes fell upon. And there's lots of jokes about this, but this is divination. This is trying to get guidance about the future, or to make a decision about the future by getting information from the the God, in this case, the Christian God, who's going to speak to you through the Bible, sometimes the King James Bible. This is something that these practices, they haven't died out. So and we shouldn't be picking on one particular Christian sect. I mean, we want to be very careful not to
Yeah.
fall into this apologetic trap.
And
Um,
I would like to add something there, if you don't mind.
sure.
The psychologist Tanya Luhrmann has a great book called "When God Talks Back," and she interviewed hundreds of evangelical Christians who describe their religious worldview as having a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's this very interactive form of religiosity where they believe Jesus is speaking to them. So they say, like, "Oh, I'm feeling prompted by Jesus to go to Boston University." This is something that's very prominent in evangelical Christianity. And so Tanya Luhrmann focuses on these Christians who describe their interaction with Jesus that way. And going back to what Dr. Litwa said, like, how is that different from divination? Like, if we want to be really sloppy, we could call it shamanism. Like, they're talking to a divine figure. So I think it is kind of we don't want to let an anti-Catholicism Protestant bias to like seep into how we describe these practices.
That's a good point.
Right. I mean, in terms of the early practices, I think the thing to keep in mind is that, I mean, all Christian rituals would have seemed weird and uh, uh, to outsiders, and they still do seem weird to a certain extent. I mean, the idea of Jesus's body being bread, and his blood being wine that was drunk in private rites only to a group of initiates. That was weird to outsiders, and I think it still is, to some degree, although maybe less so. It's just been familiarized, but the actual theology of it, the performativity of it, um, has not lost its weirdness. The idea that the spirit inhabits you after being dunked in water. This is another ancient idea that goes right up into modern times. And yes, I mean, there's nothing. I mean, again, an outsider is just going to view that as regular water. I mean, a priest may have blessed it, maybe not, but there's nothing necessarily logical about the idea of spirit inhabiting you after being dunked in a certain sort of water or sprinkled with water. But the performativity of it, and the the connections that are made in the mind, this this goes way back into antiquity. And, thinking specifically of the Simonians, and this issue of statue veneration, well, Irenaeus says that Simonians had a statue of Zeus, and they had a statue of Athena, and they set them up in a kind of niche apparently, and they worshiped them, by which seems to have been the case that they would have wreathed them with um, some kind of ornamental wreath and burned incense in front of them and maybe said a prayer. Irenaeus says the same thing about the Carpocratians, that they had Pythagoras and Jesus and Plato statues all set up in a niche, and they wreathed them and burned incense to them. So this is a classic example of statue veneration, and it's unfortunate that this comes as a polemical description, because I think if you talk to these people, this would seem an utterly normal activity, and it's just from people who recognize the divine in beings more than Jesus, and it's also from people who are much more comfortable dealing with Greco-Roman symbology. It's not that Simonians are worshiping Zeus himself; it's that they are worshiping Simon as Zeus. They are worshiping the Zeus form of Simon, and they are worshiping the Athena form of Helen. And Helen is really just another name for the Holy Spirit. Um, so Irenaeus wants to accentuate the differences here, but in fact, I think other Christians down the road, they are venerating statues of Mary and icons in a very similar way as these earlier Christians who have their own rituals of statue veneration. And yeah, is it? I mean, I'm not sure if any of this would be classified as magic, or I'm not sure if that would be helpful. But there is the sense that this is a practice; it's something concrete, and we can tell that they were doing it. And it's important to understand their thought process rather than the polemical framing of it.
Yeah, that's fascinating because I almost wonder is if this sort of the way of their worshiping, with maybe not just Jesus, maybe Pythagoras was divine. We should look up to him in a way. I almost wonder how that would have played out if this was the way that became the Orthodox or whatever. Interesting to think about that type of what that could have been like. But just to move on from that for a second, because and the only reason I'm bringing this up, because I know you and I have talked about them a little bit, is these fights where they get written about in a way by Hippolytus and others as doing these really weird orgiastic rites, sometimes described like really profane. And I've only heard one scholar who thinks there might be a chance that this actually could be real as far as following like the Bacchic rites and influencing them. But most scholars are agreeing that this is probably a polemic. It's probably not true. What can you say about this group in particular that might be true or probably just definitely isn't true?
Well, first of all, I want to be known as the scholar who, at least in the English speaking world, has definitely renounced Hippolytus as the author of the Refutation of All Heresies. So I definitely don't call him Hippolytus. But the Refutator refers to two groups which are utterly distinct. And um, he refers to the Nassenes, who are supposedly named after Naas, which is the Hebrew Nachash, or snake. And he also refers to the Iphites, and he's well able to distinguish them. And they are utterly distinguished in terms of their theology and practice. And when you read the Nicene report, um, there is a reflection on snakes, and the Nicene author or preacher, as he's called, says that everybody worships the snake, not just us, because the snake is a symbol of Christ, and the snake is found in every temple. You can go to any temple and find snake-like imagery, and that's just a reminiscence of Christ the snake. And he seems to be inspired by a number of things there. But then when you get into ophite theology, that seems to be of a later stage, and that seems to be mostly based on the Numbers passage, passage in Numbers 12, where you have Moses setting up the bronze snake, and then in John 3, the identification of the bronze snake with Jesus, because Jesus has the healing powers, and everyone who looked to the bronze snake was healed from poison. But the idea of snake equals Jesus then also gets read into the Genesis story. And this seems to be particularly an Ophite deduction, that the snake in the Garden of Eden is really Christ or wisdom speaking through the snake, and that the snake is a good symbol, is the one promoting knowledge and the one trying to free you from the arbitrary and mindless rules of the creator. That's distinctly Ophite. It's really only in Epiphanius that we get descriptions of actual rituals with snakes. And the problem with Epiphanius is we don't know if he's probably not lying, but a lot of what he says is based on rumor. So he says that the Ophites in their Eucharist, it looks pretty much the same as the early Catholic Eucharist, but they had this basket next to the Eucharistic bread. They open it and a snake crawls out and wraps itself around the bread. And he says also that they sometimes pick up the snake and kiss it. Is this true? Don't know. I mean, but that's about as bad as it gets. There's never any report about snake handling like you see in the American South, and there's never any report about them handling poisonous snakes. So that all seems to be modern phenomena. And really, honestly, yeah, it's really more of a it's less has to do with ritual practice than it has to do with theology. This focus on the snake as a symbol of wisdom.
Interesting. Now, Dr. Henry, going to your time frame, 4th to 6th century, do you see anything like that still happening at all, or is this completely is that all those type of movements are already gone by then?
I'm drawing on some distant memory here. I seem to remember the like a Valentinian church is mentioned as late as the 5th century. Dr. Litwa, you might know better than me. So like these groups aren't like gone completely. I don't know much about the Ophites at all. But in terms of polemics against different groups, I mean that continues. Like so, we've been talking about Simon Magus. The one of my favorite examples of that is the 5th century text called the Acts of Paul and Peter. And if you want to read an early Christian text that's as close to a Marvel superhero comic, go read the Acts of Paul and Peter. It's absolutely wild. It's basically a showdown between Peter and Paul and Simon Magus in front of the Emperor Nero. So kind of doing like a miracle showdown in front of this, one of the more notoriously evil emperors. And like Peter will do a miracle, and then Simon would do a miracle. So they're trying to like do one-upmanship here, like trying to show, oh, my miraculous powers are more strong. And obviously, the whole text is from the perspective that Simon Magus, he's the weaker fellow here. There's an instance where Peter challenges him to conjure angels, and so he conjures angels, but they appear as like dog-like. They're like these misshapen, not quite angelic beings. And then the whole story ends with Simon Magus being like, okay, let me show you the ultimate miracle. So that he calls for people to build a wooden tower for him. He climbs up to the top of the tower and he just starts flying. The text is really funny how perfunctory it is. It's like, then Simon Magus started to fly. I'm like, oh, all right. And as he's flying, Peter then kind of denounces him and says, let the angels carry him, drop him. And then Simon Magus falls and splatters on the ground. So it's like, again, this superhero showdown. And like the message is pretty clear. Like, these bad guys can do miraculous things. Like, we're not denying that they can control the power of demons, but they're demonic. Our power is superior in the power of Christ. So it is kind of trying to categorize miraculous or supernatural power, or if we can call it thaumaturgical powers, like wonder working. So that's at least my favorite instance of Simon Magus, but this is much later into the 5th century.
Now, what are some of the amulets that you've come across in your career so far? I know you've been looking into this kind of. What are some of the? Can you just describe one of them, maybe?
Sure. I mean, the amulets that I studied use liturgical acclamations. So acclamation is just the term for any shouted formula. It's usually pretty short, usually chanted in a crowd. So like a group of Americans cheering for the USA Olympic team, they'll shout USA, USA. Like that's an acclamation. And so a lot of these liturgical acclamations that appear in Christian liturgy, like holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, we can classify as an acclamation. And frequently in hagiographies, they're portrayed as being shouted by groups of people in the streets. And lo and behold, a lot of these acclamations appear on amulets. So there's a group of amulets that are probably from Asia Minor, also Syria. We're not quite sure, but it's that region of the Eastern Mediterranean that picture angels around the phrase holy, holy, holy. So hagios, hagios, hagios. So it's like this liturgical acclamation that's very famously chanted by angels. And it's like it's bronze. It has a little hole in it that you could have wore around your neck as a necklace. So it's something that's like literally on your body, on your person. And they have different. It's kind of like a collage of things. So you have holy, holy, holy. You have the angels. They frequently portray what's called the rider saint or the holy rider. So a guy on a horse with a spear spearing a demon on the floor. And this is the famous iconography that appears in St. George and the Dragon iconography. So it always has George on a horse, rearing up and stabbing often a dragon or a serpent on the ground. But at least in late antiquity, it's almost always a demon, and sometimes a female demon called Abizu, who was thought to kill babies, basically. So it's like this demon you want to protect, neutralize in a pregnant woman birthing room situation, like don't kill the baby. So Abizu, frequently against her, there'll be like a psalm written around the edge of the amulet, and then you have the rider saint or angels, and then liturgical acclamations. So if you notice, these are all from Christian iconography or Christian liturgical settings. So this is an example, again, of using this term syncretism. If we can think of syncretism as creating a collage or bricolage, people picking and choosing, oh, I think this is efficacious. I chant this in the church, or I chant this in the streets, this holy, holy, holy thing. And I hear this is the saying of angels. This is really important. I'm going to put this on my amulet. Oh, and this one psalm about protect me, be the defense of the Most High. I think it's Psalm 97. I'm forgetting exactly, but there's particular psalms that sound particularly powerful. I'm going to put that on my amulet too. And oh, this one saint, sometimes it's St. George, sometimes it's St. Sicinius, sometimes it's Solomon himself. I'm going to put him on my amulet as well. And you kind of create this object that has all these different strategies on it, all in one little coin-sized thing around your neck.
Wow, that is so fascinating. Last thing I want to ask you about, Dr. Litwa, is because you were talking about the killing the serpent dragon, and I'm thinking, popped in my head right away, as far as magic goes, because we think of the serpent and the dragon as being evil, representative of Satan. But if I'm not mistaken, we have this Agathos Daemon character early on in Egypt who was used. And this might not be Christian, but just to end on this as something of a magical object. What was the purpose of this Agathos Daemon, this good demon? What did it bring to somebody as far as magic?
Well, we've got a whole episode on this, Neil, and I'll let people go to your backlogs on your show. But I mean, just in brief, Agathos Daimon. I mean, he has a variety of manifestations, but yes, he does appear mostly as a snake. And I would say that, yeah, in Greco-Roman antiquity, you have the snake not as a negative symbol. And as I said, among certain Christian groups, the snake isn't negative. So in Nazarenes and Ophites, the snake is very positive. But with Agathos Daimon, yeah, focusing on his Egyptian manifestation, he's a good daimon. He brings blessing. He's the civic deity of Alexandria, sort of like the state mascot. And yeah, in this case, there is a holiday in his honor, and Alexandrians apparently invited snakes into their home, and they put Agathos Daimon in their tombs and on their coins as the daimon which gave benefits and benefited the entire people. And yeah, so he'll often appear with Serapis and other Egyptian deities, and yes, he's often carved in temples as well. And it's a great example of here, daimon. Agathos daimon is literally the good daimon, and there were other good daimones. And it's the Christians who are universally, it seems, making daimones into negative figures, and then, as we call them, demons. But it's important to recognize that as Christians are trying to change the discourse in second and third century, there are still thousands, if not millions, of worshippers who are viewing this lower sort of middle management level of deity, the daimonic level, as a positive, or at least ambiguous level of divine, in which these deities can be called upon not only to do works of destruction but works of benefit. And it's often a mix of both, but that's what they do. And Agathos daimon is a great example of that phenomena at the state cult level.
Fascinating. This has been a great conversation. Dr. Andrew Henry's channel, Religion for Breakfast, go and subscribe. Links in the description. Also, Dr. Litwa has a channel. Go and subscribe. Links in the description. And on top of that, Lord Sobek himself has a new channel. And I'm sure some of you heard about it, but if you haven't, go and subscribe to We Are Being Transformed. And
absolutely, yeah.
Go ahead, Sobek.
No, I was just going to add really quickly. The conversation we had today really brought to mind that analogy that Wendy Doniger has in her book about the telescope and the microscope, and how we kind of, scholars and people tend to look at these things either or, and we really need to find like a middle ground and understanding these things on their own terms. So it's been fascinating. Dr. Litwa, Dr. Henry, thank you so much for joining us yet again.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Very rich discussion.
And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.